The classroom buzzed with the low hum of students shuffling papers, the scrape of chairs, and murmured conversations. At the front of the room, Mrs. Harlow stood rigid, her gaze slowly sweeping across the room before zeroing in on a particular student. The atmosphere shifted noticeably as her eyes locked onto Jamal, a quiet, hard-working boy sitting in the third row. The tension in the air grew thick, the kind that everyone feels but no one dares to acknowledge. Mrs. Harlow's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him fumble through his notes, her sharp voice cutting through the room with a tone dripping in thinly veiled disdain. "I expect more from my students," she snapped, eyes narrowing on Jamal. "But some of us," she paused, her gaze lingering on him longer than necessary, "seem to have trouble keeping up." A few of the students exchanged glances, uneasy but silent, while Jamal kept his head down, the weight of her words pressing into him. What no one knew, not even Mrs. Harlow, was that Jamal's father, the school's principal, was watching everything from the back of the room, witnessing every word and every cold stare, and he was about to intervene in a way that no one expected. Mrs. Harlow had built her authority through an almost militant approach to teaching. Her rigid rules were well known throughout the school, and stepping into her classroom felt more like entering a courtroom than a place of learning. Students were expected to sit straight, raise their hands before speaking, and follow every instruction without question. She was notorious for her cold, cutting remarks, never hesitating to call out those she deemed unworthy of her praise. But there was something else, something she never said aloud but was understood by the students who had been under her watch long enough. She treated certain students differently, her gaze a little harder, her tone a little sharper, especially when it came to the black and minority students in her class. She would never say it outright, but it was there. In the way she always seemed to have an extra critique for them or would skip over their raised hands, choosing instead to acknowledge the students she favored. Those favored students often shared one trait: they weren't like Jamal. Jamal was one of the quiet ones, the kind of student who preferred to stay unnoticed. He sat near the middle of the room, his head usually bent over his work, always prepared, always focused. He wasn't disruptive, never called attention to himself, and always completed his assignments on time. But despite his diligence, he had never been able to escape Mrs. Harlow's harsh criticism. To her, he seemed like the type who could always do better, no matter how much effort he put in. While other students might receive a nod of approval for the same work, Jamal got corrections and disapproving looks. It had been this way all year, and though Jamal kept his head down and tried to ignore it, the constant scrutiny weighed on him. It wasn't fair, and deep down, he knew it, but what could he do? Mrs. Harlow held all the power in the classroom. What Mrs. Harlow didn't realize was that she was being observed, and not just by her students. The principal, Jamal's father, sat quietly in the back of the room, blending in with the shadows, a clipboard in hand as he watched his son navigate the unfair treatment with the same quiet dignity he had always shown. He had chosen not to intervene yet, hoping that this was simply a misunderstanding, perhaps a bad day for Mrs. Harlow. But the more he watched, the more it became clear that this wasn't a one-off moment of frustration. This was something deeper, more deliberate. He had long suspected that something was off, and now, sitting there, witnessing the subtle microaggressions unfold in real time, his suspicions were confirmed. Still, he remained silent, biding his time. The storm was brewing, and Mrs. Harlow had no idea that the principal, her boss, was not only witnessing her behavior but was also the father of the boy she had just belittled. Mrs. Harlow's eyes seemed to find Jamal every time she glanced around the room, searching for any reason to call him out. It began subtly at first, small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. She would interrupt him when he raised his hand to answer a question, cutting him off before he could finish his thoughts, only to praise another student for a similar response moments later. The passive-aggressive remarks became routine, comments about how his work was never quite there, or how he should know better by now. She would move through the aisles, glancing at the other students' work with barely a word, but when she passed Jamal, her voice would take on an edge. "You really should try harder, Jamal," she'd say, loud enough for the entire class to hear. Each comment chipped away at him, making him feel smaller with every passing day. But on this particular day, Mrs. Harlowe's behavior escalated. Perhaps she felt more emboldened, or maybe it was the fact that Jamal's quiet composure frustrated her in a way she couldn't understand. As she paced around the classroom, she stopped by Jamal's desk, picking up his assignment and holding it up for the class to see. "This," she said sharply, "is what happens when you don't put in the effort." Her tone was icy, and her eyes gleamed with something more than just dissatisfaction. The class fell silent, all eyes on Jamal as he sat there, trying to shrink into his seat. "I would expect better, but I guess some people just aren't raised to work as hard as others," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous undertone that made it clear her words meant something far more pointed. Jamal froze. The weight of her remark hung in the air like a noose, tightening around him as the implications became clear. The class went deadly quiet, the usual whispers and scribbles of note-taking falling away as every student absorbed what had just been said. Mrs. Harlowe didn't need to say more. Everyone in that room knew what she meant. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained motionless, refusing to look up, the humiliation suffocating him. His classmates sat in shocked silence, some glancing at each other in disbelief, others too stunned to react. And in that moment, Mrs. Harlowe crossed a line. Her thinly veiled racism lay bare for all to see. What she didn't realize was that someone else had seen it too, someone who would not remain silent for long. As the cruel words left Mrs. Harlowe's lips, the principal, Jamal's father, sat at the back of the room, his heart sinking deeper with each second. He had been observing the class with the quiet authority of someone used to watching teachers, used to knowing how to gauge when something was amiss. But never had he expected to witness what was unfolding before his eyes. For the past 20 minutes, he had carefully watched Mrs. Harlowe as she led the lesson, her strict demeanor evident as always. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the usual discipline she was known for, but his son, Jamal, had become her target, a fact that was becoming impossible to ignore. He had noticed it immediately, the way her voice shifted when addressing Jamal, how her tone became sharp, condescending, and dismissive. But it wasn't until her final comment, laden with racist undertones, that his blood began to boil beneath his composed exterior. Every fiber of the principal's being wanted to stand up and confront Mrs. Harlowe the moment those words hung in the air, cutting through the classroom like a dagger. He wanted to rush to his son's side, to protect him from the humiliation he had just been forced to endure in front of his peers. His fists clenched tightly under the desk as he watched Jamal, his boy, who had always been so strong and diligent, sit motionless in his chair, his head bowed low, visibly shaken but not allowing himself to react. Jamal had inherited his quiet strength from him, and in that moment, the principal was both proud of his son and deeply wounded for him. But he couldn't act yet. Not in front of the class, not with the eyes of every student fixed on Mrs. Harlowe, waiting for her next move. He knew the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a breach of professionalism. It was a clear violation of everything the school stood for. And worse, it was a personal attack on his son, his family. But the principal had been in this role long enough to know that rushing forward in anger would only make this situation worse for Jamal. If he acted too quickly, he could make his son feel even smaller in front of his classmates. He had to process it first, to be calm. This wasn't just about him. It was about ensuring that justice would be served for Jamal, for every student who had likely suffered under Mrs. Harlowe's bias, and for the school as a whole. So, he forced himself to sit still, his jaw clenched as he fought back the urge to speak. From his seat in the back, he watched Mrs. Harlowe continue, oblivious to the fact that she had just ruined any chance of avoiding the consequences that were sure to follow. She carried on with the lesson as if nothing had happened, her voice returning to its usual stern monotone as she shifted her focus back to the rest of the class. But the damage had been done. The students weren't paying attention anymore. They were glancing at Jamal, exchanging uncomfortable looks, unsure of how to react to what they had just witnessed. Some of them seemed frozen, trapped in the awkward silence that often follows an injustice, while others scribbled nervously in their notebooks, pretending nothing was wrong. The principal's heart ached for Jamal. He knew how much effort his son had put into school, how hard he worked to prove himself every day, and now all of that had been diminished by one careless, hateful comment. As a father, every instinct in him screamed to defend Jamal, to take him out of this room and shield him from the pain of this moment. But as the principal, he had to be methodical, had to ensure that Mrs. Harlow's actions would be properly addressed and that the school would uphold its values. He needed to wait for the right moment to intervene, when he could address this not just as a father, but as the leader of the school. He continued to observe, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Harlow. Inside, his emotions were a storm: anger, hurt, disappointment, but his face remained neutral. He needed to keep his composure, to control the narrative. The rage he felt for the way his son had been treated simmered just beneath the surface. But his years of experience had taught him how to channel that fury into something productive, something that would create real change. This was no time for impulsive action. It was time for a calculated response that would not only hold Mrs. Harlow accountable but would also set an example for the entire school community. He couldn't allow his personal feelings to cloud his judgment. There would be time later, at home, when he would embrace Jamal and let him know how proud he was, how sorry he was that he had to witness